For all that celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service.
The auctioneer had barely raised his hand when Prince William stepped forward and brought the entire palace sale to a halt. Beneath the lights rested a sapphire and diamond brooch that had not been publicly seen since Diana's death. Yet, the catalogue did not identify it as hers. It appeared under Queen Camilla's name. In one frozen moment, a private royal auction became a confrontation over memory, ownership, and a wound William had never allowed the palace to close. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William did not hesitate. He moved toward the table, ordered the auction stopped, and demanded that the doors be sealed until the jewel's ownership could be proven. The private palace auction, a closed sale of royal belongings judged unnecessary, had been presented as routine. Every piece had supposedly passed legal review. That promise now meant nothing before a single bid landed. The prince recognized the brooch instantly. He remembered Diana fastening it to her evening gown before leaving Kensington Palace, the home where she had raised her sons after separating from Charles. That memory struck harder when he opened the velvet case and saw her handwritten inventory number inside. The jewel had not been forgotten. Someone had known exactly whose it was. Camilla sat only a few chairs away. She looked at the sapphire, then at William, but he refused to meet her eyes. The queen consort, the title used for a king's wife, remained silent as the room tightened around her. Her name stood in the catalogue. His mother's name did not. The auctioneer slowly lowered his hammer without letting it touch the desk. William placed one hand over the case and spoke with cold certainty. This item does not leave the palace. Staff closed the doors. Guests stopped whispering only when he turned toward them, his anger now impossible to mistake. The catalogue carried a transfer date from years after Diana's death. That entry suggested something deliberate. The brooch had been moved into a collection linked to Camilla, not merely mislabeled. When William demanded the original ownership card, an official produced only a replacement form signed under an archive code, a hidden reference shielding the household officer involved. Then the prince saw another mark. The same code appeared beside more objects connected to Diana. One brooch had stopped the auction, but it had also opened a trail. What began with one sapphire jewel was about to uncover a far more personal struggle, because behind every altered label stood three people carrying three very different versions of Diana's legacy. To the auction staff, it was an ownership dispute. To William, it was the sudden return of a childhood memory he believed had been protected. To Camilla, it was an accusation made before she had been given the chance to defend herself. And to King Charles, summoned after the sale was stopped, the jewel represented something even more dangerous. Proof that the past he had spent decades trying to contain could still divide his family with a single flash of blue stone. William remained beside the sealed case, unable to treat the brooch as a simple object. Diana's jewelry carried more than financial value. Each surviving piece held fragments of her voice, the pressure she endured in public, and the private moments she shared with her sons before her death. The Princess of Wales, the title once held by the wife of the heir to the throne, had left behind memories that no palace in inventory could measure. Camilla felt the accusation before anyone spoke it aloud. She had spent years building a place within the royal family while living beneath the shadow of the woman who came before her. Now Diana's brooch had appeared beneath her name, turning old suspicion into a direct family wound. Alone with an aide, she removed her glasses, pressed her fingers against her forehead, and said, "I never requested that jewel." The queen repeated the words, but even she knew the records told a harder story. Charles entered the sealed auction room and stopped when he saw the sapphire. William watched his father's face change. The king recognized the piece immediately, yet several seconds passed before he could speak. That silence revealed more than any prepared statement. The brooch carried memories he had never truly confronted, and the monarch understood that his son was no longer asking about paperwork alone. William asked the question without softening it. "Did you know it had been moved?" Charles looked toward the case and answered carefully. "I knew some pieces were reorganized. I did not know this was among them." The prince heard uncertainty, not reassurance. His mother's identity had been removed through palace administration, and to him that felt less like an error than an eraser. Camilla insisted the jewel had never been kept inside her personal collection. Yet, palace insurance records showed that the brooch had remained under her household account for several years. A household account, the official record used to insure and manage possessions linked to a royal residence, carried legal weight, even when the object itself was stored elsewhere. Catherine later spoke to William in private. She told him that Diana had once intended the brooch to pass to a granddaughter, meaning the jewel already had an emotional destination. The future queen repeated that the wish had been known inside the family, making its appearance at auction even harder to explain. The question was no longer who owned the brooch. It was who had first ordered Diana's name removed. To understand how the jewel reached the auction table, William would have to return to the exact night when a quiet decision inside the palace became the point of no return. The trail did not begin at the auction. It began 3 years earlier after midnight, inside a private jewelry archive beneath Clarence's house. That evening, a routine inventory became something far more consequential. A senior custodian opened a velvet case. He found Diana's handwritten identification card and placed it beside a new ownership form bearing Camilla's household code. One signature later, the brooch vanished from the former princess's archive. Not physically, but officially. From that moment, the jewel belonged to a different history. Charles had been told the review was routine. Several privately owned pieces were being moved between palace archives to improve security, insurance, and record-keeping. A jewelry archive, the protected system used to store and track royal valuables, depended on precise ownership labels. Yet Diana's collection had never been simple. Some pieces belonged to her sons. Some were protected heirlooms, and others were waiting for a final family decision. That confusion created the perfect opening. The senior custodian placed a file before the king and claimed the sapphire brooch had no surviving beneficiary designation. Charles read the page slowly. Camilla remained beside him and suggested placing the jewel temporarily under her household's insurance account until its future could be clarified. The queen said it would stop the brooch from being lost between households. Her words sounded practical. Their effect would prove devastating. Charles held the fountain pen above the temporary transfer authorization. That document, a written permission, allowing an item to be managed elsewhere for a limited period, should never have changed permanent ownership. He hesitated, then signed. The king believed he was solving an administrative problem. Instead, he quietly separated Diana's name from an object filled with meaning. Camilla never asked to wear the brooch. She never requested that it be sold, but the queen consort also failed to insist that Diana's identity remain attached to it. Her silence became part of the decision, and years later, William would see that silence as a choice. Months passed before the deeper change occurred. Someone removed the temporary transfer sheet and replaced it with a permanent ownership certificate. Diana's handwritten card disappeared from the main file. The brooch had not moved yet. Its history had been rewritten. The same senior custodian later joined the committee preparing valuables for the private palace auction. An auction committee, the group responsible for approving and cataloging items for sale, now linked the midnight inventory directly to the scandal that stopped the hammer. Then William found the detail that changed everything. Camilla's initials appeared beside a handwritten instruction, ordering the brooch case to be relabeled. She had not merely been informed. Her mark sat beside the change. Armed with that discovery, William no longer wanted an explanation delivered through aides. He wanted Camilla across the table with the jewel between them and nowhere for either of them to hide. The confrontation happened behind a closed drawing-room door, without auction staff, courtiers, or legal advisors to soften the words. William entered carrying the sealed jewelry case. Camilla was already waiting beside the fireplace, outwardly composed, but visibly pale. He placed the brooch on the table between them and asked one question. Why was my mother's name removed? For several seconds, the Queen said nothing. That silence struck harder than any denial. And the prince understood that this meeting would change their relationship permanently. William had refused a formal palace briefing because he believed prepared language would bury the truth. A palace briefing, a controlled meeting where officials explain a royal issue before public action, would have surrounded the moment with careful phrases and legal distance. He wanted none of it. Charles had asked to attend, but the prince insisted on facing Camilla alone before the investigation began. Camilla watched as William slid the relabeled case toward her. He pointed to the handwritten instruction and asked why her initials appeared beside the order. Removing Diana's identification card. The Queen admitted approving the new label, but she said the change had been temporary and necessary for insurance. Her answer came quickly. His reply came colder. Temporary decisions do not put a jewel up for sale. Camilla stiffened. She told William the brooch had never been chosen by her, and had never been kept among the pieces she personally wore. The Queen Consort said she believed officials were protecting the item while the family decided its future. Yet, the prince could not separate that explanation from the catalogue bearing her name. William accused the palace of treating Diana's belongings like objects without a family. Camilla's control broke. She said she had spent years being blamed for decisions made by the wider institution. Even when others signed the documents and gave the final orders, the institution, the system of royal offices, advisors and household departments surrounding the crown, had protected itself before, she warned, and it would do so again. William's restraint finally shattered. This was not the institution's name on the catalogue. It was yours. Camilla gripped the back of a chair but refused to step away. The Queen looked directly at him and admitted signing a broad disposal approval covering dozens of household objects. A disposal approval written permission allowing possessions to be sold, transferred, or removed gave officials the authority to prepare those items for auction. Camilla insisted she had never seen the individual list. She had not selected the brooch, but her signature had opened the door. Then she revealed the detail that made William fall silent. Charles knew Diana's jewelry records were being reorganized. Camilla could not say whether the king knew her household had gained legal control of the sapphire piece. But his approval stood somewhere inside the chain. William turned toward the door. Camilla stopped him with one final warning. Challenging the sale would expose decisions his father had personally authorized. The conflict had moved beyond Camilla. The signature with the greatest power belonged to Charles, and William was preparing to make the king answer for it. Charles had spent his reign insisting that the crown must remain larger than private pain. Yet, when William laid the transfer authorization before him, the monarchy suddenly became painfully small. A father, a son, and the memory of the woman neither could discuss without consequence. The king's signature stood at the bottom of the page. It had allowed Diana's brooch to enter Camilla's household records. Now Charles had to decide whether protecting his wife was worth losing the trust of his heir. Charles read the authorization alone before William entered. His hand paused over the signature, and he turned the page face down, as though hiding his own name might reduce its weight. The royal household, the offices and staff managing the monarch's official and private affairs. He had acted under his authority. Even if others had changed the document later, his signature had opened the door. William entered without ceremony. He had already suspended the auction and ordered palace security to retain every object carrying the same archive code. The prince now controlled what happened to the sale, but only Charles could force the wider household to surrender its records. That difference mattered. One man held the future of the auction, the other held the power to expose how the scandal began. Charles admitted signing a temporary transfer. He denied approving any permanent change of ownership. William asked why he had never checked what happened afterward. The king answered that he trusted the household and wanted to avoid reopening old wounds surrounding Diana. William's anger sharpened. He told his father that silence was not peace. The prince argued that refusing to speak his mother's name had allowed officials to alter her legacy without resistance. Charles defended Camilla, insisting she had not personally placed the brooch in the auction. William answered that accepting control of the jewel created a duty to protect it. Charles looked again at the original form, a transfer authorization. Written permission allowing temporary control of an item carried an expiry date at the bottom. That date did not appear on the later certificate. Someone had removed it, turning a limited arrangement into permanent ownership. The discovery changed the room. Charles immediately ordered every object from the same inventory review frozen. He stripped the auction committee of its authority and demanded an independent family audit, meaning a separate examination of the records without interference from the households involved. William then received the final detail. A documented internal note showed that the official who altered the record had acted after receiving instructions from a member of Camilla's private office. The Queen's inner circle was now directly connected to the change. Charles did not defend the decision. He looked at his son and said suspending the auction was only the beginning. Camilla's household would have to surrender every item linked to the disputed transfer. The order traveled through the palace within minutes, and behind one closed door, Camilla learned that the scandal had moved from accusation to consequence. The consequences arrived without ceremony. Security officers entered the Queen's private jewelry storage with a royal warrant, sealed 3 cabinets, and removed the inventory ledgers for examination. Camilla stood nearby as familiar cases were numbered and carried away. No one accused her aloud. No one needed to. For the first time since becoming queen, she watched palace authority move around her rather than through her, and understood that William's decision had stripped her of something more fragile than power: trust. Charles's freeze order covered every jewel and valuable transfer during the disputed inventory. A royal warrant and official written order carrying the monarch's authority allowed officers to secure the collection, while each object was traced back to its true owner. Camilla temporarily lost control of the affected pieces, and the auction was cancelled completely. Every bid became void. Every specialist connected to the records was contacted. A security officer approached Camilla and asked for the smallest key on her personal ring. She held it for several seconds before placing it in his open hand. The final cabinet was locked. The Queen said nothing, but the gesture carried its own verdict. Something she had once controlled now belonged to the investigation. Camilla remained alone after the officers left. She looked at the empty space where the sapphire case had rested and told her private secretary, "They have already decided what they believe." The Queen repeated that she had never selected Diana's brooch for sale. Yet, she knew her signature and household account had made that defense harder to accept. Charles arrived later without aides. Camilla accused him of choosing William's anger over his wife's dignity. The king explained that an independent audit, a separate review conducted outside the offices being investigated, was necessary to protect the monarchy's credibility. She answered bitterly that the crown always demanded sacrifice from the person it found easiest to isolate. Charles did not deny her pain, but he refused to reverse the order. He told Camilla that trust could not be restored, while questions remained unanswered. The Queen heard the finality in his voice. For the first time, his duty stood openly against her. Investigators soon found 2 more pieces from Diana's collection on the disputed transfer list: pearl earrings and a small diamond bracelet intended for her children. Neither item had reached the auction floor, but the bracelet had been scheduled for private appraisal under Camilla's household account. That discovery changed everything. The sapphire brooch was no longer an isolated mistake. The senior custodian from the midnight inventory was suspended. Camilla's private office lost all authority over future jewelry loans, sales, or transfers. Then, Catherine contacted William directly and requested a private meeting without aides. She was carrying a letter written by Diana about the brooch's intended future. As Camilla faced the collapse of her authority, William was about to discover that his mother had already chosen the jewel's destination, and that choice would transform anger into resolve. There were no officials in the room when Catherine handed William the letter. No lawyers, no palace seal. Only 2 people sitting across from one another as he unfolded a page written in his mother's hand. Diana had described the sapphire brooch as a piece she hoped would one day pass to a granddaughter. Not because of its value, but because blue had always made her feel brave. William read the final line twice. His anger did not disappear, it changed into something clearer: purpose. Catherine had found the letter years earlier, among personal family papers kept for William and Harry. It was never treated as a formal will, a legal document stating how property should be passed on after death. But it carried something just as powerful: Diana's personal wishes. The sapphire brooch was meant to remain within her direct family line until one of her granddaughters was old enough to understand what it represented. William kept reading until his hands began to tremble. Catherine moved closer and placed her hand over his wrist, but she did not interrupt him. The princess understood that this was not simply about jewelry. It was about a son, hearing his mother's voice again through words she had left behind. The prince finally admitted what the catalogue had done to him. Seeing Camilla's name beside the brooch made him feel as though the palace had replaced Diana twice, first in life, then in its own records. Catherine listened without defending anyone. She only reminded him that restoring the truth would carry more force than publicly destroying the queen. William knew she was right. Protecting the brooch could not become an act of revenge. If anger guided every decision, then Diana's memory would be trapped inside the same conflict that had already caused so much pain. The future king decided that accountability mattered, but humiliation would not become the final answer. Catherine then pointed to one line near the end of the letter. Diana had named Charlotte as the natural future recipient, if William ever had a daughter. The princess read the sentence aloud, giving the brooch a clear emotional destination and returning meaning to something the auction had reduced to a price. William folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the sapphire case. He signed an instruction restoring the jewel to the Diana, Princess of Wales family collection, a protected group of personal items preserved under her name, with a future designation for Charlotte. The prince then spoke to Charles privately. He would not demand Camilla's removal from royal duties, but the queen had to surrender every claim over Diana's disputed belongings and support the correction publicly. Camilla accepted the condition. She prepared to face the family, the palace staff, and a public already gathering beyond the gates. The private battle had found its answer. But one image, Diana's brooch beneath Camilla's name, was already igniting a national reckoning. By sunrise, the private auction was private no longer. The image dominated broadcasts, phones, and newspaper stands. Diana's sapphire brooch photographed beside an auction card carrying Camilla's name. Outside Kensington Palace, people arrived carrying blue flowers and photographs of the late princess. What had begun as a dispute over one jewel became a national argument about memory, loyalty, and whether royal records had attempted to give one woman's history to another. William's decision was confirmed in a short palace statement. The prince had halted the sale, and the ownership of several items was now under review. A palace statement, an official message issued on behalf of the royal household, avoided directly blaming Camilla, but it admitted that the brooch had been wrongly catalogued. That single admission gave the public everything it needed to understand the seriousness of the mistake. Broadcasters framed the crisis as a struggle between Diana's legacy and the authority of the current queen. Commentators argued over whether the catalogue reflected deliberate appropriation or reckless palace administration. The debate spread quickly because the jewel was not just valuable. It had become proof that a name could be removed even when the memory behind it remained powerful. A major morning newspaper captured the feeling with one full-page front cover, Diana's jewel Camilla's name. The image appeared in shop windows across London before palace officials finished their first emergency meeting. Outside Kensington Palace, one woman tied a blue ribbon to the gates with the handwritten words. Her name mattered. Within hours, hundreds more appeared beside flowers. William watched the crowd footage in silence. When Charlotte entered and asked why people were carrying blue flowers, he told her they were remembering her grandmother. The princess listened quietly, and the future king understood that the scandal had already moved beyond his own anger. It now belonged to the next generation. Camilla saw the same newspaper cover and felt the public connect the jewel to the deepest controversy of her life. The queen chose not to fight the symbolism. Instead, she signed a written renunciation, a formal document giving up a legal claim covering the brooch, the earrings, the bracelet, and every disputed piece linked to Diana. Charles then ordered the corrected inventory released to the family. The king confirmed that the sapphire brooch had always belonged within Diana's history and should never have entered Camilla's auction account. The consequences were immediate. The jewelry custodian was dismissed. The private auction system was suspended. Future royal sales would require approval from an independent heritage panel and the original owner's direct descendants. Only one meeting remained. The jewel would be returned, apologies would be spoken, and the monarchy would decide what this scandal truly meant. The public had delivered its judgment in blue ribbons and silent remembrance. Now the family had to restore what the catalogue had taken away. The final meeting was not held in an auction room or beneath the machinery of palace authority. It took place with the sapphire brooch resting inside its original velvet case. Diana's name restored to the card beneath it. Charles stood beside Camilla. Catherine remained near William, while Charlotte waited quietly across the table. No one pretended the damage had been harmless. Yet, for the first time since the sale was halted, the family was no longer arguing over who controlled the jewel. They were deciding what honor required. Charles had already read the completed audit. The review of full examination of the ownership records and decisions behind the transfer confirmed that Diana remained the rightful historical owner. Camilla's household had lost any valid claim the moment the temporary authorization expired. Every other disputed piece was removed from the Queen's records and returned to the family collection carrying Diana's name. The king opened the velvet case and handed it to William. Charles did not blame the dismissed custodian or hide behind palace procedure. He admitted that failing to protect the jewel's identity had been his responsibility. No matter who altered the final record, the monarch had signed the first document. Now he accepted the weight of what followed. William took the case but did not soften the truth. He told his father that Diana's belongings could never be separated from her name, simply because remembering her made the palace uncomfortable. The prince accepted the apology, yet he refused to pretend that years of silence had caused no damage. Camilla then faced William directly. The Queen acknowledged that she had approved the reabelling and failed to ask what that change would mean to him. She surrendered every claim connected to Diana's disputed belongings and admitted that she should have protected the boundary between her own household and the former princess's legacy. William did not offer instant forgiveness, but the future king accepted her words as the first honest recognition of why seeing Camilla's name beside the brooch had caused such pain. The prince then turned to Charlotte. He explained that the jewel had belonged to her grandmother, who wanted it to remain with the women of her family. A family trust, a legal arrangement protecting an item until its chosen recipient is ready, would hold the brooch for the young princess until adulthood. Catherine closed the case and promised Charlotte that she would learn its full history before ever wearing it. The sapphire was no longer merchandise. It had become a story entrusted to the next generation. Charles permanently cancelled the auction and removed every official who had manipulated the records. William created a protected archive bearing Diana's name, ensuring that her belongings could never again be reassigned through hidden paperwork. The hammer never fell, the sapphire never left the palace, and the name beneath it was restored. In stopping one auction, William ensured that his mother's memory could never again be treated as someone else's property. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.